Hi, I'm Stephen Wilson from Aspire. Today we're live with a program focused on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its ongoing implications that were produced in collaboration with our sister channel, Who Else Loves History. As Melville Patillo Bills, acclaimed author and member of the Little Rock Nine, reminds us in a recent conversation.
Don't think of the Civil Rights Movement and Black History Month as something outside of you. My dear friend, Black History Month merely brings up an issue that is your issue as well, which is, are you equal? This is the most important gift you've been given, which is your own equality, your own place in life. And it is maintained throughout your life, through adulthood, knowing who you are, what you've come to contribute, and what you have a right to, and what you have a right to contribute is the most important gift you have in your life.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a major milestone in America's continual journey to provide all Americans the opportunity to do just that, to offer that gift to the world in the best way we can. For today's program, host Tim Gore is joined by a panel of experts and a student audience to explore the provisions and impacts of this historic legislation. Want to join in on the conversation? Send us your respectful questions and comments in the chat.
Five hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions, divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country.
And with those inspiring words and an estimated 75 pens, President Lyndon Baines Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Welcome to the Thomas F. Eagleton Federal Courthouse Act of 1964 and its ongoing implications. We're very glad that you're joining us here in the William H. Webster courtroom inside the Thomas F. Eagleton Federal Courthouse. We're being joined by students from two schools in the St. Louis area, Confluence Academy and Clayton High School. They'll be asking questions during the program. We've received questions in advance from our web and television viewers as well, and of course you can send us your questions during the program. We've got a great panel that's joining us. Let me start by introducing Rigel Oliveri, Associate Dean from the University of Missouri School of Law. Rigel, thanks very much for being with us today.
Good morning. Thank you very much.
Give the students a little bit of an idea about your background, your relationship to civil rights, and how you got to be an Associate Dean.
Certainly. I actually began my legal career as a lawyer for the United States Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division. I prosecuted cases under Title II of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is the public accommodations part of the statute. I also prosecuted cases under the Federal Fair Housing Act, which was part of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. I then became a law professor, and now I have the very great fortune to teach my students employment discrimination law and fair housing law.
To her left is Reuben Shelton, president of the Missouri Bar. Reuben, thanks for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Give the students a little bit about your background and what does the president of the Missouri Bar get to do?
The president of the Missouri Bar gets to call himself the president of the Missouri Bar. No, it is one of the great organizations in this country. We have more than 30,000 members. I'm chair of the Board of Governors, which is about 45 members. It's an exciting job. Kind of my entry to the civil rights. I actually worked in this courthouse. We were actually in a different courthouse at the time. We were across the street. But I was a law clerk for the Honorable Clyde Cahill. and we dealt with many aspects of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So I'm glad to be here and discuss it today.
Thanks very much, Reuben. And to his left is Pam Means, president of the National Bar Association. Pam, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
How did your legal career get started, and et cetera?
Graduated from University of Iowa. I'm a native of East St. Louis, Illinois, and I practice at Thompson Coburn Law Firm. Started my legal career there, and I'm a partner at the law firm, been there for 18 years, and now I'm president of the National Bar Association. It is the oldest African-American minority bar association in the country, started in 1925 when lawyers of color could not join the American Bar Association. We represent, speak on behalf of over 60,000 lawyers of color, and we aim to protect and preserve the civil and political liberties of all.
Thanks so much for being with us, Pam. And I want to go down to Austin, Texas, because we're also being joined by Mark Updegrove of the Lyndon Baines Johnson Presidential Library down there. Mark, come in and say hello to everybody.
Hello, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks very much, Mark. Talk a little bit about your relationship to LBJ and just the nature of what we would see when we get to go down there and see the LBJ Library and Museum.
So we are both an archive of all the material of the Johnson administration, as well as a museum depicting his life and his administration, and hopefully its relevance to today's Americans.
That's great, Mark. Thanks very much. We're really glad you're here. We're going to start our conversation by talking about the historic and cultural context of the time, and Mark will stay with you about that because give the students a little bit of background. Obviously, the legislation gets passed in '64, but the civil rights movement had been going on for a long period of time in the United States up to that point in time. They may be very familiar in the 50s with Brown versus Board of Education and, of course, Rosa Parks and the bus boycott and those kinds of things. But even before then, there was civil rights legislation. Can you give the students a sense of what was happening in the country at the time?
Well, America was a far different place a half a century ago. Race has been the great contradiction in America since before our founding. And while we have etched in our Declaration of Independence the words, all men are created equal, that was not a reality in this country until the civil rights laws of the 1960s, including the Civil Rights Act of 1964, made it so. We finally fulfilled our promise as a nation in recognizing all citizens equally when the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 were put into law by Lyndon Johnson. That gives us an opportunity to recognize all Americans equally. Prior to that point, that was not a reality in the United States of America.
And there is significant activity that was happening, but one of the things that made a difference, I think, in the 50s and the 60s was that a lot of that activity was suddenly seen by people across the country. Media made a difference, and they could actually see how police forces were responding to the activism that was going on down south and in all sorts of places. Talk a little bit about the media age. What do you think? How do you think, Mark, that affected the ability to get legislation to Congress that made a real difference?
I think Lyndon Johnson, among others, recognized the importance of Americans seeing what people of color were facing in this country, the injustice that was prevalent around these United States. And there's a great conversation. Lyndon Johnson taped many conversations that he had throughout the course of his presidency, and we have them featured throughout our museum exhibit. One of the conversations was with Martin Luther King. And LBJ says to Martin Luther King, if you want a voting rights bill, you need to take your folks in the civil rights movement. You need to take them to the worst places in the Deep South and show Americans what oppressive conditions people of color are facing in those areas. If you get that on TV, if you get that on the radio, if you get that in the newspapers, and he said, this is a direct quote, there isn't a fellow who doesn't drive a tractor who won't say that isn't right, that isn't fair. So LBJ encouraged Martin Luther King to wage the civil rights movement, knowing that if the press picked this up, Americans wouldn't stand for it. We would want to see justice prevail, and the laws that Lyndon Johnson wanted to sign into law would go into place. And indeed, that's more or less what happened.
Mark, I'm glad you referenced the relationship between LBJ and Martin Luther King, because LBJ was very much a hands-on person in this regard, and we actually have an audio from a different phone conversation than the one you mentioned that you all provided to us to give the students an idea about the relationship between President Johnson and Martin Luther King. So we'll play that now so you get a sense of the dynamic between them, and then we're going to go to some student questions from here. So Jocelyn and Deanna, while this video is playing, you guys can move to the microphone. Let's watch that video now.
I've been locked up in this office and I haven't seen it, but I won't tell you how grateful I am and how worthy I'm going to try to be of all your hopes.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so happy to hear that, and I knew that you had just that great spirit, and you know you have our support and backing.
Well,
because we know what a difficult period this is.
It's just an impossible period. We got a budget coming up. We got nothing to do with it. It's practically already made, and we got a civil rights bill that hadn't even passed the House, and it's November, and Hubert Humphrey told me yesterday everybody wanted to go home. We got a tax bill that they haven't touched, and we just got to not let up on any of them and keep going, and I guess they'll say that I'm repudiated, but I'm going to ask the Congress Wednesday to just stay there till they pass them all. They won't do it, but we'll just keep them there next year till they do, and we just won't give up an inch.
Well, this is mighty fine. I think it's so imperative. I think one of the great tributes that we can pay in memory of President Kennedy is to try to enact some of the great progressive policies that he sought to initiate.
Well, I'm going to support them all, and you can count on that, and I'm going to do my best to get other men to do likewise, and I'll have to have y'all's help. I never needed it more than I do now.
Well, you know you have it, and just feel free to call on us for anything.
Thank you so much, Martin.
All right.
Call me when you...
To the family.
I sure will. Call me when you're down here next time.
I certainly will.
Let's get together, and any suggestions you got, bring them in.
Fine. I certainly will do that.
Thank you so much.
So there you get a real sense about the dynamic between those two leaders. And we've got a couple of questions from students, and I'll just have you guys read them back to back, and we'll deal them as a group. So Jocelyn, let's start with your question. What is it?
Was there any backlash for the white individuals that supported the Civil Rights Act?
So that's one important thing for us to think about is backlash issues. And Deanna, what was your question going to be?
Given the climate of the nation at the time, how did the civil rights legislation get through Congress? So
there's a couple of issues there that we want to talk about just in regard to the cultural context of the time. Backlash for white people that were in favor of it, and just how it gets through Congress. We'll start with the first part, Mark, and then we'll come back to you to deal with part of what Johnson was able to do as we went through it. But Pam, what can you tell the students about just the nature of what the coalition was, of a variety of people coming together for this civil rights movement, and did whites in the South have to worry about backlash, that kind of thing? What's your familiarity with that?
Oh, absolutely. I wasn't born at the time, but I am a lover of history, and there was absolute backlash. The need for civil rights wasn't something that was just embraced by people of color, but it was embraced by people who understood that mankind was alike. And at the end of the day, we all bled the same kind of blood. And so you had whites, you had Asians, you had people of color joining together, making a cry, men, women, even children. Parents were bringing their kids out, and absolutely whites took a hit, and they risked their lives because they thought it was a worthy cause. Not because they just wanted America to see what was going wrong. They really believed that the individual that didn't look like them actually had all the same rights that they did, and that it was their obligation to some point to help people that did look like them to understand that you can't treat another human being like they're subpart. And sometimes that's the best way to get it, is for the message to come from those that look just like you. But yes, they absolutely did take a hit, and families were threatened, and individuals were killed. Mm-hmm. Some died. Mississippi burning.
That's correct. That's right. If you aren't familiar with that history, look that up. Jocelyn, thanks for that question. And Mark, talk a little bit about just the time and getting the passage. Obviously, at this point, President Kennedy's been assassinated in November of 1963. What was the impact of that assassination on LBJ's ability to work legislation like this through Congress? Did an upswelling of sympathy or legacy thoughts for Kennedy make a difference? And then just talk a little bit about Lyndon Johnson and his political acumen. How is he able to make deals, and what is he able to do?
That if you hear in that conversation Martin Luther King say, I think one of the great tributes you can pay in honor of President Kennedy is to support some of the progressive policies he sought to initiate. Well, one of those progressive policies was the Civil Rights Act that he had proposed in the summer of 1963, but that had gone nowhere in the halls of Congress. LBJ takes the presidency, and you could hear him say to Martin Luther King, "I'm going to support them all, and you can count on that." Well, the one thing is that Martin Luther King couldn't count on that. Lyndon Johnson could not be necessarily counted on to support the Civil Rights Act. His record on civil rights had been somewhat mixed, in large part because he was from Texas and had to remain politically viable. And in order to do so, could not be seen as a great supporter, a great champion of civil rights. So when Johnson gets the power of the presidency, however, he can do what's in his heart. And he supports the Civil Rights Act that Kennedy had proposed and has the legislative prowess to get it through Congress. He was a massive, a great manipulator. He had great prowess in understanding the legislative process. And he realizes that he can use the martyrdom of John F. Kennedy to implore reluctant lawmakers who might not have supported Kennedy's Civil Rights Act to do so in the wake of his assassination. But in order to do so, he needs to get Northern Republicans who have stood in the way of civil rights in the past to come over to his side and to defeat the Southern Democrats who are absolutely intractable on the matter of civil rights. Lyndon Johnson reaches out to the minority leader of the Senate, Everett Dirksen from the state of Illinois. Dirksen mobilizes Republicans, and ultimately the longest filibuster in the history of the Senate is overcome, and the Civil Rights Act passes in what is a very triumphant victory for Lyndon Johnson and for the senators and congressmen who support him.
Thanks very much, Mark. That bipartisanship is an exceptionally important thing for people to realize, because there were a lot of Southern Democrats opposed to the civil rights legislation, as Mark mentioned, and so the idea about bringing Northern Republicans on board was essential to their ability to get the legislation passed. So the legislation is passed. Let's talk a little bit about what they were after, constitutional concepts that they were trying to make sure were embodied in the legislation, and then what the provisions of that act were. Now, Reuben, the 14th and 15th Amendments are really important here because they're the ones applying due process and equal protection. Correct. We've got some graphics we can bring up so people can see the text, but talk a little bit about these 14th and 15th Amendments. What were they designed to do, and why do they matter so much here? Well,
essentially to make people equal in housing and employment, to put everyone on an equal footing. And you have to understand the kind of the tenor of the time. Going back to what we just discussed, there was a lot of public pressure there. I mean, we were making incremental steps. The court made some rulings that, for instance, all deliberate speed in the Brown versus the Board of Education, but that all deliberate speed was pretty slow. So we were making these incremental steps, but things weren't really getting done. And this type of legislation was very much important. Keep in mind that President Kennedy, he wasn't pushing this thing as hard as we might have wanted him to push it. So he was no big champion in his own right. But there was public pressure brought to bear during that time. And as Pam mentioned, there was a cross-section of individuals, a cross-section of groups that came together to push this legislation and to put pressure on President Johnson to do that. But the whole idea of these amendments was to put everybody on the same footing. The Equal Protection Clause, the abolition of slavery, and even then, it still had some problems, and we had to work some things through. But that was basically those amendments.
And we'll bring the 14th Amendment up because, Rigel, I want to ask you from the legal scholar perspective, when we're talking about due process and equal protection, what does that mean exactly? How do I know due process when I see it, so to speak?
So due process basically means that the state cannot deprive you of your life, your liberty, or your property without giving you a fair process, usually in court. Equal protection means that the state cannot treat people differently, that the state is supposed to treat everybody the same. One of the reasons why the Civil Rights Act ended up being so important was because even though we'd had those constitutional provisions for 100 years, they only applied to the state. They didn't apply to how private individuals or companies treated each other. And so even though you could have a system where ostensibly everyone was treated equal in the eyes of the law. If you had massive levels of discrimination by restaurants against customers, by employers against potential employees, some of the guarantees that were in the Constitution didn't really matter all that much in people's day-to-day lives because they were facing discrimination from other sources.
And you mentioned that hopefully the students are aware of the fact of like the historic events of sit-ins at different places, whether they were the Woolworth lunch counters or whatever the case would be. The fact that there were certain sections of movie theaters for certain groups of people and not for other groups of people, the water fountains, all of that kind of thing. These areas of public accommodation, but that's not the state. So there's a part of the Constitution that's really going to matter to us in order to make this work, and it's what's known as the Commerce Clause. Let's bring that up so we can talk a little bit about this. Rigel, too. Talk about the Commerce Clause, Article 1, Section 8, if I'm remembering my history right, I hope, and how did they use it so effectively?
So in order for Congress to act, it has to be given authority within the Constitution. And the avenue that Congress saw for being able to address things like discrimination in movie theaters, restaurants, hotels, employment, and other avenues of life was through its ability to regulate interstate commerce. The idea of interstate commerce as a concept is something that had been steadily expanding throughout the last century, and it came really to be determined by the Supreme Court that virtually any commercial activity that you engage in, even if you just have a little store and you only sell products, you know, in your one little corner of your neighborhood, your activity affects interstate commerce. Money is changing hands. You have customers potentially from all over. You're buying goods and services and products from, you know, that have passed through interstate commerce. And so the ability for Congress to legislate, to regulate interstate commerce was its reason why that it invoked for why it could regulate the employer-employee relationship, why it could tell restaurants and hotel owners and theater owners that they had to serve all members of the public. It was because of their connections with interstate commerce and Congress's ability to legislate in that area.
And there are specific titles of the Civil Rights Act that deal with that. We've got lots of student questions about provisions of the Act and its implications, and we're going to get to those. Before we do, let's know what those provisions were. Title II obviously dealt specifically with public accommodation. So it's injunctive relief against public accommodation, and that's what you're referring to when you think about the Commerce Clause, the interstate commerce. The fact that, you're right, it's just my hotel, you know, it's just the Bates Motel on this highway in Arizona, but believe it or not, it does have something to do with interstate commerce as well. And it's Title VII, if I'm remembering right, that deals with equal employment opportunity, but again, employment is a huge part of the country's economy, obviously. So if we're going to regulate interstate commerce, then it's going to apply. And there's a variety of other things. It also establishes in Title V, it establishes or just changes the way the Commission on Civil Rights works. Reuben, what was the purpose of the Commission on Civil Rights in terms of the legislation? The
Commission on Civil Rights was to sort of oversee that provision to make sure that the act was being implemented the way it should be. The commissioners were appointed by the president, and we've had members in St. Louis who were on that commission for civil rights. But it was essentially to make sure that the act was implemented the way it was supposed to be.
Let's begin to get student questions about provisions of the act. I want to invite Kate to come on up because she's going to ask one about the act that you might not think applies, but it's very interesting as well. So Kate, take it away.
In what ways did the Civil Rights Act impact women specifically, since the act outlawed both gender and race discrimination?
So that's a great question, Kate. Pam, talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think women would say they had a long way to go even after the act. And that's why you see a lot of legislation as dealing with women. But the ideal behind the act, as Reuben stated earlier, was for states not to be able to discriminate against anyone, male, female, race, gender, all of it. That was the impetus for the act. But as it related to women, I agree that's a very interesting question, because I think, as people called them back then, which I don't know if I agree with that term, feminists would argue that their rights were delayed in some respects, and there were other things that they had to do in order to fight for those rights. But to be honest, they were embodied within the Civil Rights Act, and they rested right there. It's just sometimes you have to remind people of what they give you, and sometimes they think you don't know your right. And so sometimes you have to remind them that you have them, and they have to abide by them.
It's one thing to have it written down, it's another thing to see what the implementation looks like.
Right, and that's where courts become so important.
That's where
courts become important. It's all about the implementation of the act. Now, you may not be aware of this little bit of history, but there's an interesting story about how women even got involved in the act itself. Rigel, talk a little bit about that.
Sure, it's kind of a funny story. Obviously, most of the political and social movements leading up to the passage of the act were around the area of race discrimination. And that was originally race, color, religion, and national origin were the original protected characteristics that the act was meant to cover. And sort of at the last minute, without any real preparation, a opponent of the Civil Rights Act, Representative Howard Smith, a Democrat from Virginia, introduced an amendment on the House floor while the act was being debated to add 2 words to it, and sex. So it would cover discrimination based on race, religion, etc., and sex. And when he did that, the entire chamber broke into laughter, and everyone thought it was the funniest thing that they'd ever heard, because why on earth would women's rights be included in this bill? He clearly was introducing it in an attempt to kill the bill, that colleagues of his who he thought might vote in favor of the race protections would never want to vote in favor of the protections for sex. That backfired on him. Obviously, it did pass, and it did contain sex as well as a protected category. And it had a pretty huge immediate impact on women's ability to get employment. That was, prior to that, it was standard practice for jobs to be listed as for women or for men. And the good jobs were for men, and the less good jobs were for women. And that practice had to go away, and it really did pave the way for women to make tremendous gains in employment.
About pay equity, but,
Certainly, absolutely.
We're not there
but
yet.
It did sort of open up it changed things in a way, sort of overnight in some very obvious ways that helped women make gains in the workforce.
I think that's a great little story, just in terms of, one, you learn that it's a Southern Democrat who's opposed to the legislation. 2, he's putting something in the legislation, he's hoping killing it, and then 3, in essence, makes it even stronger than originally. Mark, I'll go to you. Are you aware of any response that President Johnson had to this moment in time? Did he think, oh my gosh, we're going to scuttle it, we're going to be in trouble, or did he say, aha, this helps us, or anything like that?
Well, I think he was relieved. He was pleasantly surprised by that development. But it was, as was mentioned, a measure that was done to try to defeat the bill, to try to make it less appealing. And it absolutely backfired, but happily as far as Lyndon Johnson was concerned.
Very cool. Let's go to some more questions. I'm going to invite Kareem to come up from Confluence Academy to ask his question. Kareem, come up to the podium. We're going to talk a little bit about interstate commerce some more and how this all happened in terms of Congress's ability to do its job. Thanks, Kareem.
Could private owners only provide business to those individuals in their state and therefore only provide services to the individuals that they choose because it would not be interstate commerce?
It's an interesting question, because at this point in time, we're not dealing with the internet or anything like that. I mean, to a large extent, if I'm a small business owner, let's say in the town I grew up in, Pittsburgh, Kansas, most of my people are going to come from Pittsburgh, Kansas. So Reuben, as we look at Kareem's question, was there any people saying, well, look, most of my business is from just, my town here.
Yes, there were. Yes, there were. I mean, they were trying to skirt this law from day one. It's not involved in interstate commerce. It's purely private. We have no connection with the government whatsoever. I should be able to do what I want to do. I mean, that happened. Unsuccessfully in most cases, but it absolutely happened.
And there was an important Supreme Court case that happened not too long after the legislation was passed, the Heart of Atlanta motel case. Rigel, talk a little bit about that. What did it do, and how did it help define for everybody? We talk about it all comes down to courts, implementing the law. How did that help define what we were talking about?
Right. And that's where the Supreme Court affirmed the idea that Congress was acting properly under its Commerce Clause authority. There was a hotel that was basically making the argument, we just exist in this one little place. We only serve sort of a small community of people. How are our actions affecting interstate commerce? And the evidence that was put before the court, that the court relied on, made very clear that certainly a hotel takes people who are travelers from all over different states. The inability of African Americans to travel freely and stay places in the South was a big problem. And so that affected commerce right there. then you can get into even more details about, the equipment that the hotel used, the food that it served, the furniture that it had. Much of that stuff also traveled through interstate commerce. Virtually nothing in our society anymore sort of comes only from one small place. And so even then, this hotel's activities implicated interstate commerce in a number of different ways, and the Supreme Court upheld that in the case. And that basically eliminated the challenge that Congress was surpassing its authority to pass the legislation.
And there you get a really good lesson about the role of the court, defining what the law means in terms of real practice. We've got some other questions we're going to get to dealing with other aspects of the legislation, including its effect on people with disabilities and race effects. But we want to take a moment, since we're talking about gender and race kind of together, and give you an excerpt from an interview we did with Dick Gregory, a comedian and activist from St. Louis, in a previous program that we did, where Dick kind of summarizes his take on the impact of the act and its relationship to both gender and race issues. So take it away, Mr. Gregory.
When I first started riding planes, a black man couldn't be a pilot. A black woman couldn't be a stewardess. A white woman couldn't be a pilot. A white woman couldn't be a mechanic. The only thing a white woman could do on a commercial airline, she could be a stewardess, but she had to look like something off the center page of Playboy magazine. Because of the civil rights legislation that didn't say for Negroes only, anytime you get on a plane today and see an old, ugly, short, fat white steward, we got her that job. It came through that civil rights movement. Not through her brother, not through her daddy, not through the Marines. We did.
And we might not have all phrased it exactly as Mr. Gregory did, but he makes a very good point. There are all sorts of implications of the act. I don't know if I want to call them unintended consequences because it seems kind of negative, but things you don't expect necessarily to happen that do indeed happen, and that's obviously one of them. That's correct. He's on the St. Louis Walk of Fame. If you come to St. Louis, you should go and see his location. Let's go to some more questions. We got an internet question about another group, dealing specifically with disabled folks, talking about the fact that there's IDA, that it applies to education. There's the American with Disabilities Act. Rigel, talk a little bit about the impact of those pieces of legislation. Are they a direct beneficiary, so to speak, of the Civil Rights Act?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the important things to keep in mind about the Civil Rights Act was it didn't cover everybody. It only covered very specific protected characteristics. The employment provisions only covered sex, race, color, national origin, and religion. What that meant, though, was that it provided a template for future legislation. So we got the Age Discrimination in Employment Act. We got the Americans with Disabilities Act. We also got legislation that covered other human endeavors besides employment. We got the Fair Housing Act, for example. So all of those statutes, if you look at them, you can see sort of in their structure where they are direct sort of close cousins to Title VII, to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They contain the same kinds of employment discrimination provisions, the same kinds of public accommodations provisions. What I think the act did was it provided a model for us to think about, we started with certain groups and certain activities, but should that be broadened? Should more people be included? And that's what the future legislation was able to do.
It seems like we're a society of incrementalism, that we can't do it all at once, that we have to take baby steps and then build up to the total.
And I think sometimes it's that we don't recognize and we don't realize until that group is impacted, that group actually brings to the attention the unfairness of the treatment. Because sometimes we don't even perceive when we walk into a building that doesn't have a ramp, that is an injustice because we actually can walk up the steps. But an individual that can't do that, immediately for them, that becomes an issue.
Good point. Sophie from Clayton right here has a question for us. Go right ahead.
So I know you guys were talking a little bit about consequences kind of the Civil Rights Act, and I know we've been talking a little bit about gender specifically and disabilities also, but I was wondering kind of what some other consequences, both intended and unintended, have been of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Thanks, Sophie. Before we get to your answers, I also want to give us a chance to hear directly from President Johnson himself, because obviously some of the consequences they were anticipating were going to be consequences, especially from southern states. What were they going to do in response to the act? What were individuals going to do in response to the act? Would people rise up in rebellion? Would we have the situation where George Wallace is going to stand in the door of the school and not let anybody in, or whatever the case may be? He was aware of the fact that this piece of legislation was going to be controversial, and he spoke in a speech directly to the nation about that, and we got a little excerpt of that as he talks a little bit about what this legislation is and what it isn't to try to deal with that, and then we'll come to our panel to deal with Sophie's question.
The purpose of this law is simple. It does not restrict the freedom of any American so long as he respects the rights of others. It does not give special treatment to any citizen. It does say the only limit to a man's hope for happiness and for the future of his children shall be his own ability. It does say that there are those who are equal before God shall now also be equal in the polling booths, in the classrooms, in the factories, and in hotels and restaurants and movie theaters and other places that provide service to the public.
Mark, I'll come to you first since we just heard from President Johnson directly, and then we'll come to the other panelists. Was there serious concern from the Johnson administration about how the act would be perceived? What did they make preparatory steps for National Guard activity or whatever the case may be? How worried was he about some unexpected consequences that might occur?
There was great concern that there would be backlash in the South and that the provisions of the law would not be obeyed. And that's why the Civil Rights Commission was established, to ensure that over time the South in particular carried out all provisions of the law. Tim, may I just talk about unintended consequences of the bill? There are many legal unintended ramifications of the Civil Rights Act. But the one thing I would mention, it was a happy surprise to Lyndon Johnson as well, is that he said that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the best foreign policy decision he made in his first year in the presidency, because it made the world look at the United States differently. For the first time, again, as I mentioned earlier in the program, we were looked upon as realizing our promise as a nation. And we were recognized for our moral authority when we finally addressed the great contradiction of race. So our stature in the world rose as a consequence of finally delivering civil rights.
That's a very cool point, Mark. Thanks very much for mentioning that. And Pam, when you hear Sophie's question about intended and unintended consequences, what pops into your head?
What pops into my head is the tension, the level of growing tension between the races. Instead of the act and the law actually healing the situation, it actually, in some cases, made the divide greater, because people actually did feel like, even though Lyndon Johnson said it's not impeding upon your rights as long as you respect others, people didn't see it that way, and they held true to really believing that all men were not created equal. And I think one of the unintended consequences is the deaths of a lot of civil rights leaders. And I think individuals thought these individuals were agitators. If you get rid of them, then we get rid of the problem, and then we don't have to go any further. And I think that's one of the most unfortunate that people don't think about of this act, is that while, yeah, this was a great piece of civil litigation, a piece of litigation for us, and it was, and Johnson saw it as a great foreign policy, I believe the implementation of it, people saw the contradiction in America, that while we had on paper that people were equal, it still took us a long time to actually get to the reality of it. And to me, that's an unintended consequence, because it leaves people still separate but unequal. And so where it meant to bring them together, to be one, we don't see that happen for a while.
Reuben?
And President Johnson mentioned that this is an act not for preferential treatment, but whites clearly saw it as an act of preferential treatment for blacks, especially under Title VII, the Equal Employment Opportunity Act. You know, some of the remedies that came out of Title VII for disparate treatment and, you know, all the other theories of law, you know, the one that came out was this thing called affirmative action, that whites clearly saw as preferential treatments for blacks. And I'm not sure that it doesn't still exist today.
Absolutely it does.
Rigel?
I think that I think there were some positive unintended consequences too. I mean, as I was saying before, I think one of the things that the Act got people used to thinking about was that discrimination in employment and in public accommodations is something that's not acceptable. Now, does everybody think that? Did it make everything perfect overnight? No. But I think it kind of it's almost baked into our cultural consciousness, this notion now that discrimination isn't okay. I think sometimes people think the Act does more than it does. I mean, I hear people all the time saying, well, that's discrimination, and can't I sue over that? And I'll say, well, it's got to be one of the bases covered by the Act. So I think people kind of got used to thinking that equal treatment is supposed to be the law, and we're supposed to have a remedy for it if we don't get it. Whether or not everyone agrees with that, I think that's kind of permeated into our culture, and I think we're used to thinking that way now, when that was certainly not the norm before that.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Thanks very much for that question. I want to go to questions now from Kira and Jonae and Luke right here, so I'll let you guys come up to the microphone. We're going to ask all three of them because they're going to give you a chance to kind of put the Civil Rights Act in some historical perspective. So we'll hear them and then we'll take it away from there. Kira, go right ahead.
My question is, what do you think our country would look like if the 1964 Civil Rights Act had not passed?
So if we didn't have the Act, what would our country look like? And then Jonae picks up on that a little bit with a variation. Take it away.
If you can go back in time, what would you change about the civil rights?
So would you change something about the Act itself? And then Luke, go right ahead.
Is the Civil Rights Act still needed today?
So all of those questions deal in terms of like the long-term impacts of the legislation and how it helps our world today. So I'll let you guys pick up anywhere you want to from that. But in terms of like what our country would look like if we hadn't had it, if you could go back in time and change something, what would it be? And do we still need it today? I'll go to you first, Pam.
Absolutely.
What pops into your head?
One thing we wouldn't have is you sitting in this room today together, me being a lawyer, Reuben being president of the Missouri Bar, me being a partner at Thompson Coburn Law Firm. None of those things would have happened without the Civil Rights Act. My ability to be as aggressive, demanding as I want to be, none of that would have happened without the Civil Rights Act. We really do, in my generation and your generation, we take for granted the shoulders and the fight that was fought for us just to sit next to each other. That wouldn't have happened. The fact that you guys got up and asked that question, it never, ever would have happened. And so when I think about, is it needed today? You better believe it's needed today.
Reuben?
Discrimination and bias, those are things that we pick up, through life. Whether it comes from your family, your friends, your environment. That's just the way it is. We're certainly not born with it. My grandfather used to say that you can't legislate your heart, but you can legislate actions. And that through your actions and experience, your hearts will change. And I think that that is absolutely correct. The more that you interact, that groups interact, whether it's male, female, white, black, it doesn't matter. The more you interact, the more you better understand what the other person is all about. The more you understand that they are a lot more like you than different from you. And so what the Civil Rights Act did was force the interaction. It forced the action. And absolutely, I think we need it today, because as long as we're humans, I think human nature says that we want to be around people and we want to associate with people who are just like us. Whether you're white, black, red, or tutti frutti, you want to be around people who are just like you, right? And it's only until you go out and interact and have experiences and work and play with people who are different from you that you actually get that different mindset.
Rigel?
As far as today goes, I know that just for employment, so this would be just under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, last year there were almost 94,000 complaints filed to the EEOC. Now, not all of them, had merit, but there was 94,000 instances of somebody who felt they were discriminated against and took the step of actually reporting it and filing it with the EEOC. So there was probably many more people that didn't bother to do that. That's a big number. And what that also doesn't capture is all the things that employers do and that places of public accommodations and whatever do because of the act. I mean, I think the employers now have gotten used to knowing that they need to have, you know, fair procedures for screening their applicants and for deciding who to promote. They don't always do it, which is why we still have all of these complaints. But at least now we've got HR departments which actually have sexual harassment complaint procedures that they, you know, for people to follow. None of that would have existed without the Civil Rights Act. And I don't know, if the Civil Rights Act were repealed tomorrow, I don't know how much of that would remain in place. Certainly, I think that the existence of so many complaints, civil rights cases of this nature, just under employment discrimination alone, are the third most common type of case on the federal court docket. It used to be the first most common about 10 years ago. 6% of all of the cases are that. So that shows us that we still need it. The fact that there's that much litigation and that many complaints means it's still important.
And the professor said earlier that the Civil Rights Act spawned a lot of other legislation like the ADA, American with Disabilities Act. You know, it is expensive to make an accommodation for people with disability. But for the fact that people have to do it now, you know, I don't think that they would go through that extra expense to do that. So I think, you know, the Civil Rights Act, along with all of its progeny, they're very much still needed today.
Mark, as an historian, how would you answer the questions?
Well, the one question I was asked was, what would you change about the civil rights movement? And I think what I would have changed is that we had two civil rights laws go through in the before the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 and the Civil Rights Act of 1960. Those were important only insofar as they were symbolic. They were the first civil rights laws to be passed since Reconstruction. So nearly a century passed before we had a law dealing with civil rights. But they were also largely impotent. They were rendered toothless in committee. And so they were more or less meaningless. If we could change things, I would have had them mean something so we could have been spared the many lives that were put on the line or lost because of our fight for civil rights in this country. Martin Luther King said the moral arc of the world spins toward justice, but it spins very slowly. I wish it had spun a little faster.
And Mark, I want to go to you for a slightly different question as we move into our last 5 minutes here, and that's looking back on it maybe from President Johnson's perspective. Obviously, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then equally important, or perhaps even more important, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. If Johnson were able to speak to us today and look back in time, what do you think he'd say about the legacy of these two pieces of legislation? How proud is he? How surprised is he? What comes to mind with that kind of question?
I think the proudest piece of legislation he signed was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which frankly allows for Barack Obama to become the President of the United States. The Civil Rights Act was enormously important as a first step in making public accommodations accessible to all Americans. But voting rights restricted obstacles at the polling places. And that allowed people of color to register their choices for who they wanted to represent them, which is enormously important and was fundamentally transformative in our country's history.
Thanks very much, Mark. I'm going to give you all a chance to do a little bit of summary as well, about 60 seconds each. We've talked a lot about civil rights, the legacy of this act. Rigel, if you're going to leave these students with some ideas that they should think about them becoming involved in civil rights activity themselves, about them making a difference in dealing with the legacy, what would you say to them?
Wow, that's a great question. One thing I would say is certainly if you are interested in any of this, the law is a wonderful thing to go into. It's a wonderful area. Some of my proudest moments were as a civil rights lawyer, and I would encourage anybody who wants to be active in a way that can really change things. That's one fantastic way to do it. If you don't want to be a lawyer, that's fine. You can still be involved and vote and pay attention to the issues as they're coming forward. You're going to be getting to voting age soon if you're not already there, and so it's really important. After all the hard-fought rights to exercise the franchise came forward, our voting rates today are actually pretty low, particularly for young people. So I would say, become involved just in that one regard, exercise the rights that you have. But certainly, anyone who's interested in the law, you can make a big difference that way too.
Reuben?
Enjoying the Missouri bar. No, a lot of pillars in the civil rights movement. They lived, worked hard, and died, you know, for this system, this great society. And I do think it's a great society that Lyndon Johnson initiated when he was president. It's a shame that more of us don't get involved in the process, that more of us are not active in this society and in our political system. And I think it is just critically important that you make your voices heard, that you bring your input to the table, because you know the future is right here in this room, and we just can't do it without you.
Pam?
I completely agree with Reuben, and I would challenge you to do this. Not just go out and vote. Ask yourself, is there really an ability for us as a people, when I say people, as a human race, to ensure that the person sitting next to me is treated exactly the same way that I want to be treated. Put yourself in their shoes. And so I would say the best legacy that you can give to those that died for you is for you to be an agitator and to never stand back and watch anybody abuse somebody else, or to make the little joke that seems comfortable to you uncomfortable to someone else. Don't be a part of it. That's the best way you can pay the legacy and to ensure that the respect and the spirit of the Civil Rights Act is actually carried out.
Pam, thank you very much. Reuben, thank you very much. Rigel, thank you very much. Mark Updegrove down in Texas, thank you very much for being part of this program today. We want to thank specifically all the great folks at the federal courthouse for making this happen today. Yay, team. And of course to the Missouri Bar. Learn more about the Missouri Bar and all their great website resources at mobar.org. That's mobar.org. Bye.